Bom dia a todas e todos. É um prazer muito grande estar aqui com vocês esta manhã para nossa última sessão de FAU Encontros relacionada às disciplinas de pós-graduação e graduação aqui da FAU, coordenadas pelo professor Hugo Segawa, por mim e pelo Ivo Giroto. Eu quero fazer um agradecimento especial ao FAU Encontros, a Rose, Maurício, Luiz, Diógenes e Rodrigo, que se mostraram incansáveis em nos ajudar e possibilitar toda essa transmissão que enriqueceu demais as nossas disciplinas. Muito obrigada a vocês, reconhecemos o esforço que nos atenderam generosamente e gentilmente a todas as nossas solicitações de um modo absolutamente eficiente. Muito obrigada a vocês. E bem-vindos, então, a essa nossa palestra com Tzonis e Liane Lefraive. Muito obrigada.
Bom dia a todas e todos. É uma satisfação estar hoje com o professor Alexander Tzonis e a professora Liane Lefraive nesta sessão que eles estão presentes e vamos em seguida passar a palavra para eles. Mas nós gostaríamos de fazer um esclarecimento, enfim, uma orientação, porque nós programamos inicialmente que a apresentação seria com duas palestras da professora Liane e da professora Alexander, mas por circunstâncias eles pediram que nós fizéssemos uma pré-gravação das palestras, o que fizemos, claro, com a presença deles, naturalmente, né, para, em seguida, termos os debates, enfim, a conversação com eles. Todavia, ao final das gravações, a professora Liane Lefraive falou quase 1 hora, e o professor Alexander Tzonis também falou quase 1 hora na gravação. Isto acaba tomando as 2 horas que os FAU Encontros são programados para 2 horas de duração. Então, nesse sentido, para nós não perdermos estes preciosos depoimentos, essas falas, nós dividimos esta sessão com Liane Lefraive e Alexander Tzonis em 2, hoje dedicado à apresentação, vamos dizer, das conferências deles, de Liane Lefraive e Alexander Tzonis, e vamos abrir uma sessão também aberta por YouTube para a próxima segunda-feira, dia 30, às 9 horas da manhã. Então, vamos dizer que esta conversação com Liane Lefraive e Alexander Tzonis terá hoje as 2 palestras deles, e na próxima segunda-feira, às 9 horas da manhã, teremos uma sessão de debates, de conversação com Liane e com Alex. Então, isso, ao longo da apresentação de hoje, da sessão, vocês verão no chat as informações relativas, a orientação relativa a esta próxima sessão que teremos na segunda-feira, das 9 às 10 horas da manhã, aproximadamente. Feito esse esclarecimento, é uma honra nós termos hoje Liane Lefraive e Alexander Tzonis, e numa situação privilegiada, porque ambos escreveram há tempos, em 2003, publicaram um livro sobre regionalismo crítico. E agora, no próximo mês de dezembro, daqui a pouco, a Routledge de Londres estará publicando a 2ª edição deste livro, revisado e ampliado em 30%, rediscutindo e atualizando a questão do regionalismo crítico como uma categoria analítica, como uma condição. E é com este objetivo, essa sessão de hoje, de segunda-feira, será a primeira apresentação mundial deste livro que eles estarão lançando em dezembro. Então, é um grande privilégio termos hoje eles aqui e podermos conversar na segunda-feira Enfim, eu espero que isso seja um momento para alargarmos, estendermos os horizontes de nossos diálogos e de nossas compreensões sobre os fenômenos contemporâneos. Liane, Alexander, it's a pleasure to have you today and coming Monday for our conversation. Please let me invite you for a couple of words for our audience, please.
Well, first, Monica and Hugo, muito obrigada for organizing this. And to the students, our apologies for having spoken for the long session that you're going to be exposed to now. Actually, we could have spoken for 8 hours apiece, but you're getting off easy with just 1 hour apiece. But thank you very much for coming.
Okay.
Well, I want to thank you also that you give us this opportunity to present our ideas in the middle of this crisis. I want also to thank the technology that makes communication by being separate, but by making this communication makes us all being part of one region, the human region and the human ecology. I wish you to have a good time listening to this rambling and discussion presenting our long-term ideas and our more recent responses to a very critical moment of humanity. And I wish also to have after that a good weekend, and we meet you, I think, on Monday. Very good. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Liane and Alex. We will start. Nós vamos começar a passar o vídeo. A primeira parte, o primeiro vídeo será com a professora Liane Lefraive a respeito, enfim, deste livro.
Thank you, Professor Segawa, Hugo, for inviting us to present this lecture to you today. Thank you also to Luciano Migliaccio, Gustavo Rocha, Fernando Diniz Moreira for being our respondents. Thank you to Monica.
Okay.
No sound.
handle destruction. And third, the third issue that we'll be addressing is how we should be thinking about regionalism today as a polemical act of resistance to global forces, as jingoism, or what Hugo Segawa in his Architecture of Brazil wrote about as ufanismo, or rather as a way of engaging in a collaborative way with a global world which is constantly threatened with divisiveness. These themes will return again and again like leitmotifs throughout our talk. Alex will now make a few introductory remarks. Then I will present the first part of the lectures, and then Alex will present the second.
I will be very brief. I wanted to stress one issue, how a crisis like the crisis today has in it the potential of creativity and change. This is built into the history of humanity, but also the history, one might say, of ecology. This is how new things happen out of destruction. However, and this is what we should reflect, I think, in the very end, there are many ways of being destructive. Being destructive and creative, as there are many ways of being innovative and actually putting new wines in old bottles and nothing else. Now, I wanted to stress how exciting it is that this technology, that many people, the technology of distance, electronic interaction, that many people have been so afraid that would be dividing people, it brings us actually together. And it brings us together at a moment of crisis, but also at a moment that crisis takes us apart. In other words, we have the possibility and the compulsion to create and come together, at the same time, the danger of falling apart. If you look into the psychology of families and the organizational history of enterprises, not to mention also the history of political movements and parties and states, the moments of difficulty, the moments of crisis, when resistance would be possible by getting together, in fact, history and psychology tells us that by rule we have terrible centrifugal forces that dissolve communities, dissolve structures, dissolve institutions. In other words, the phenomenon of exit, division, intolerance. And this is a reality which is happening today. And I want to stress that what we are doing here, coming together, using a supermodern technology, in fact, goes against the grain of decomposition, conflict, division, and conservatism. Now, the agenda is open to us to look at this discussion about crisis as an opportunity of becoming a stronger bonded community of people in dialogue and moving ahead into the future. I will talk a little bit in the conclusion about that, and for the moment I think the core of this presentation is, or the ball is in the arms terrain, and the core of this presentation is the discussion of how actually this conflict and dialogue, innovation and destruction of globalization and regionalism has taken place. Thank you.
As I said before Alex spoke, one of the characteristics of our approach is the historical one. This, the book that we wrote, as I said, begins with ancient Greece and goes through the history of regionalism since then. I'm not going to dwell on the Middle Ages, on the role or on the Renaissance and the role that regionalism played in a democratic movement against absolutism in Rome. I'm not going to talk about the role it played in England and in Germany with anti-absolutist movements, with the rise of nationalisms in Europe after Napoleon's defeat. I'm not going to deal with the colonialization by Europe of the rest of the world. I'll leave this to Alex if he wants to mention it. But rather, I will give an overview of some of the more familiar examples of regionalism in 20th century architecture up until today, to remind us all how relevant it has been in recent times. I could go on for hours and even days with a list of all the important projects, but I'll limit myself in the interest of time. I'll limit this selection to a very few but iconic projects. The rest, if you're interested, is covered in our book, the new edition of our book, which is here. For this overview, I'm going to begin with a case that you all, of course, know very well. Juan O'Gorman's house for Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. Before Europe became busy with its self-destructive World War I, Mexico had emerged as a new social democratic nation after the Civil War of 1910 and 20. A cultural renaissance arose, whose overriding expression was the bonding of indigenous and local folk art with avant-garde European movements like Surrealism. The president, Álvaro Obregón, and his Secretary of Education, José Vasconcelos Calderón, supported a movement which united painting and murals, glorifying a Mexicanidad of the people. Vasconcelos Calderón initiated the well-known muralist movement, with the aim of constructing a national identity for the masses. During the Depression in the 1930s, of course, muralism took over the United States and by storm, but their Marxist politics raised problems, such as when Diego Rivera's mural was ordered plastered over the Rockefeller Center. This is one that he did in Mexico, of course. he, along with Frida Kahlo and the other muralist painters, believed that this regionalist art was not just a cultural movement, but also a means for social and political reform. During this period, the government also constructed schools and hospitals. Interestingly, Rivera, the acknowledged leader of the artistic avant-garde, denounced architects for their subservience to the machine aesthetic of Le Corbusier. The first architectural expression of Mexicanidad then was the house that we've just seen by Juan O'Gorman, who had been, of course, a follower of Le Corbusier. The houses were painted in the same vivid colors found in Frida Kahlo's Zapotec dresses, Diego's in terracotta, which clashed with the shocking blue of Frida's, the two linked by a tenuous bridge accessible only by a tortuous helicoidal staircase, which mirrored in many ways their own fraught relationship. This style of the house of Frida Kahlo and Rivera, of course, will influence Mexican regionalists like Luis Barragan, Matias Goeritz, and Ricardo Legorreta later. But O'Gorman himself would abandon it ultimately, although inspired by international ideas of socialism, in fear of globalization sponsored by the United States, as well as the still remembered oppression of the country by the Spanish Empire. The regionalist movement in Mexico continued to grow during World War II. The National Autonomous University of Mexico, planned by, is certainly, and the library designed by O'Gorman, is certainly an example of, although all the Mexican architects would copy the house of Frida Kahlo and Rivera, he decided to adopt a very different style. This gigantic mural added a strong statement of Mexicanidad identity. Like the museum that he was going to build with Rivera to house Rivera's collection of Aztec Anahuacalli art, along with O'Gorman's own house, it goes further infusing art and architecture, incorporating the elements from the native Mexican Aztec culture. This project, of course, everybody knows even better, and it launched this curvaceous interpretation of what a modern regionalist architecture should be, followed, as Hugo Segawa pointed out in his book, a first period of modern architecture in Brazil, dominated by the figure of Rocha-Peixoto, which finally gave way after the trip, especially of Le Corbusier and his adoption of La Loi du Méandre, to this curvaceous, very iconic, what was going to become the iconic mark of Brazilian architecture, and which had its influence probably in the rest of Latin. I'm not going to dwell on the Brazilian examples for obvious reasons, but I just wanted to say that its love of the curve probably influenced other architects in other countries in Latin America, like Ricardo Porro in Cuba, in his School of Applied Art, and even probably this project by Enrique Miralles and Benedetta Tagliabue, covering the market of Santa Catarina in Barcelona very recently. Of course, the regionalism of Brazil was not only about curves, in this project, Pedregulho by Afonso Redi, the accent was on housing, not social housing, but still, it was a very enlightened example of housing with a multifunctional set of uses implanted on the site, which was occupied beforehand by favela. This project, I'm not obviously going to dwell very much on Lino Bobardi, but this project in 1987 in the north of Brazil incorporated the curves to a certain extent, but also a new agenda, adapted to a new agenda, which was to provide a space for the Afro-Brazilian population of this area of Salvador, and that is, it responded to a social agenda. We turn now from South America, which we've flown over very quickly, to the United States, to a very important work of Frank Lloyd Wright. Here we have the Winslow House, which was the beginning of a turn away from the Beaux-Arts style that had been incorporated, that had been embodied, rather, by the Columbia World Exposition of the late 1890s. It made Frank Lloyd Wright furious, and in reaction to it, he developed what he called the Prairie Style, with its undecorated planarity, basically, and a horizontality. He and others have claimed that it should be called the Prairie Style because it was a reflection of the vast, endless openness and horizontality of the prairies in the middle of the United States, in the heartland of the United States, which Chicago was one of the main centers of. However, I think that it was Frank Lloyd Wright also himself always acknowledged, at this point in his career at least, what he called the Oriental quality of his work. And it's generally assumed that the Hoho-Den temple, the shrine that was reproduced at the World Fair, which was very famous and the most popular by far of all the exhibitions of the World Fair, World Exhibition, influenced his hotel in Tokyo, and they often, and most people overlook the importance of this secondary building, which was a tea house that was on the site of the big Japanese presence at the Chicago World Exhibition. It's the so-called tea house, conceived like the rest of the exhibition by the great Japanese art historian Okakuro Kazuko, the future author of the best-selling Book of Tea in English in 1903, and who became subsequently the curator of Asian art at the Museum of Fine Art in Boston. Indeed, if one compares the tea house to the Winslow House, built a year after the closing of the fair, the resemblance is striking. Like the tea house, the Winslow House is in a way unprecedented in American architecture, starkly unadorned and planar, and displays an unbroken horizontality, and is topped with the windows along a ribbon under a long and straight hip roof with deep overhangs. The Winslow House was the quintessential work of American regionalism. It's no paradox, however, that the Americanness of American regionalism in this case was influenced by a Japanese prototype. In fact, we find the same thing in reverse in the regionalist projects of the 1930s in Japan, which incorporated as part of the Japaneseness of Japanese architecture elements from the West. For instance, as Isozaki has pointed out in his book called The Japaneseness of Japanese Architecture, we have the house of Kenzo Tange, which incorporates the aesthetics of the Katsura Palace with the Bauhaus, grosso modo. This trend is continued in Kenzo Tange's Kagawa Prefecture, which is a fusion of Western concrete construction with traditional Japanese construction techniques. And we find it even more recently in this project for a museum by Kingo Kuma. Come back to the United States, we find that there are several strains of regionalism in the 1950s and early 60s. We have two projects, one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast, that start to take their cue from the relationship of the building to the landscape. In the first case, it's a project by Edward Larrabee Barnes, and it's called Seaside. And it's for an artist's colony in Maine, and it's meant to explicitly bring artists into a community in nature in which they can feel free to express themselves artistically. The second one, of course, is the famous Sea Ranch by Charles Moore and his colleagues, which is really one of the best American projects of the whole 20th century. The way it translates the topography of the landscape into the aesthetics of the building. The purpose is the same as with the Ed Larrabee Barnes project, that is to cement the links between the community that lives there among each other and to the land, to the ecology, to the natural, to the world of nature. Here's another example of American regionalism, much more recent, by James Turrell in Texas. Here, the purpose isn't so much to fit into the landscape, but into the skyscape, the magnificent sky of Texas, in this church for a small church for Quakers. And finally, here's another example, very recent, of American regionalism, again in the responding in an ecological way, in a much more explicitly ecological way, using local wood, juniper wood, to build this so-called Cottonwood Canyon Experience Center for people who want to come to Oregon, to the state park in Oregon, to experience the ecological reality of the site. It's by Signal Architecture and Research. Here's yet another rather, but definitely counterintuitive example of American regionalism. It's the very first tensile structure that was designed by Buckminster Fuller, and he did it with students of his in North Carolina. And what it was meant to do was to house a modernized cotton mill. And it very surprisingly, in a state, and that is North Carolina, that had been perceived as being very conservative, here we have the major newspaper of the town presenting this building as the true regional architecture of State College of Design, which is a very interesting deviation from the purely formal definition of what a regionalist architecture should be. Buckminster Fuller and his students intended this building to house a very regionalist kind of productive unit. So it's a highly innovative project. Another example of American regionalism, and one that was very important for us, and we quoted from it in our very first writings on critical regionalism, are the writings of Louis Mumford. He wrote the first history of American architecture, and in this book he presented Richardson, Henry Hobson Richardson, as the first regionalist, and he became fascinated with regionalist architecture before the First World War. However, and went on to found something, an organization with several of his colleagues called the Regional Association of America. The reason he moved from a purely formal definition of an interest in single buildings as regionalist to a more broad approach, which encompassed regional planning, is maybe the most serious environmental disaster of the 20th century, and that is the Dust Bowl, that's been forgotten now to a large extent, but which displaced people in the late 1920s, people, and ruined the economy of the agricultural economy of the United States. I won't go into it, there's a big section of it in the book. But in general, he had an influence on planning ideas. This is heavily influenced by the Regional Planning Association of America, and it is the first plan for Chandigarh in India. It preceded Le Corbusier's plan, which was simply an orthogonal grid plunked onto the landscape, regardless of the topography of the terrain and of the uses of the different zones. This, as you can see, it was done by Matthew Nowitzki, an architect who was closely associated with Lewis Mumford. And as you can see, it follows the lay of the land and of the body of water. What's important about it is that well, the reason it wasn't implemented and that Le Corbusier's was, is that unfortunately Matthew Nowitzki died in a plane crash on his way back from Chandigarh to the United States very soon after his plan had been developed. One of the last places you would look for a real regionalist project in the world is the Netherlands. In fact, this is an ironic take on what regionalism can be. It's a hotel in the Netherlands. But we did find that there is one very interesting example of regionalism in Ippenburg in the Netherlands, designed by NBRDV and Winnie Maas. It is ironic. I mean, it is surprisingly based on an idea that comes from Lewis Mumford and the American Regional Association movement, and that is that you separate out of if you're going to build a new town or a new housing project, which this is, you eliminate the cars and you form a town based on pedestrian circulation with the cars parked outside in order to enhance a sense of community, maybe a tradition, which is traditional in Dutch towns, in this new town. Now we come to the Mediterranean. We find the same kind of attachment to the topography, to the land, in this project by Dimitri Piccionis, which is the pathway on the Philopapos Hill, and also on facing the Acropolis, which he also built designed a path for. What's regionalist about this is that it really is an attempt to enhance in the head of the public that uses this pathway a realization of what the true landscape, the ancient landscape of the Acropolis and surrounding the Acropolis was when the Acropolis was built. And this, if anybody, anybody who's been to Athens knows that this is the only trace of this reality. We come also to another example in the Mediterranean of a project, the Casa Malaparte, which is also wedded to this landscape, not the ancient landscape, but the real natural landscape of the Mediterranean, which this tries to fit into in an unobtrusive manner, on one hand. On the other hand, you have another current of, I wanted to say that this project of Malaparte was very much opposed, even in his mind, to the kind of monumental architecture that was being built by the regime of the fascist regime in Italy at the time. The monumental architecture in the name of Italianità. This was a very different kind of regionalism and very opposed to that. Another kind that was opposed to that was that which was presented by Giuseppe Pagano and Guarniero Danieli, which was a return to rural architecture as a source of inspiration. We find the rural architecture incorporated in Greece. Now we're still in the Mediterranean, by Aris Constantinidis, by the Spanish architects of the time. But another example of Mediterranean architecture is this skyscraper. Not everybody was interested in mimicking or copying or incorporating the aesthetics of vernacular architecture. This building by Sainz de Oita in Madrid uses the same principle, in fact, as Afonso Redi used in his high-rise, which is meant to respond in a modern, contemporary building type to the relentless rays of the sun in a way that avoids, to a large extent, air conditioning. This takes us to, now we're running around the world. We're in the Middle East, in Iraq, in the late 50s, where Gropius was invited to build one of many projects that were being built at the time in the country. And he was invited to build the university, which is really a very artificial and very fake. This is an example of a fake kind of inappropriate use of an element to pretend that the building was a regionalist response to the site or to the culture. Much more realistic was the project. That is architecturally realistic. It never worked really as a project, as a new town. But this is New Gorna in Egypt, near Luxor, by Hassan Fatih. Much more authentic, at least in its adaptation to the vernacular architecture. We go now to another current of 20th century regionalism in architecture, and that is a mostly tropical architecture, which instead of mimicking the vernacular around or responding to the topographical reality of site, uses modern materials and modern technology in order to adapt to this very special climate. This was Jean Prouvé's, one of the three maisons tropicales designed by Jean Prouvé in the late 1940s. We find the same tendency in this project by Jeffrey Bawa for a steel company. It's an office and housing project in Sri Lanka. And in this housing project by Minette de Silva, which also was sensitive. It was a low-cost housing for the poor of Sri Lanka, as opposed to Jeffrey Bawa, who worked for very rich clients and prestigious projects. She worked. She besides designing luxurious houses, also was interested in housing the poor of Sri Lanka. And this is a pressed mud project built by local technicians in a local vocabulary, but adapted to in a way that the traditional housing was not, to the tropical climate. This is Charles Correa, who's not known for this kind of architecture, but this is a very early project of his. After he'd left MIT, he went to India, and this project, which is the Hindustan Pavilion in an exhibition of the early 50s in India, is based on circulation of air and the Venturi principle. It's really a machine for cooling. It's a building which was a machine for cooling. Another example of this is the Golden Mile project by Tai Keng Soon and William Lim in Singapore. It's a building which still stands, part of which, it's a complex that was never built completely, but the one unit that was built still today is a model of climate, a building that responds to climate in a way that absolutely precludes the necessity for air conditioning. Very recently, we find a series of projects which are regionalist in a different way. These are Hong Kong students working in China. Working in China in the Fujian province, which is tropical, and the students from the Foram, led by their professor Foram, decided to build this very simple bamboo hut in order to shelter the rice paddy workers from the heat. This is Regionalism, not only about relation to tissue of the building and microclimate, but also not only using materials which do not need to be imported. However, the shape of the building was produced through the best
kind of delicate program, conceito program. But also, most importantly, expectation is for carrying out in a community of students and workers. Of course, those who serve as categories in the 1960s, the movement, however, of the time, however, they have a different kind of very profile in the system. Support today more than any other time before.
We're coming to an end now, very soon. This is another project, another project of the same type, using low-tech local workers to build. This is in Bangladesh. It's a school built by Anna Heringer. School was designed by Francis Quéré in the same spirit, using, again, local workers and local materials. This is a project also in Africa by Toshiko Mori, a Japanese architect. It was done under the auspices of the Joseph and Annie Alberts Foundation. It was the Keystone, not the Alberts. Oh, and Alberts. She worked for free for this. It's in Senegal, in Scythian, and it's again built by the same, under the same circumstances, to house an art school, an art colony, in which local artists can come together and form a community. Now we're in China, where yet another where memory becomes an element. The importance of memory becomes important in the definition of what a regionalist architecture should be. This is the first project by Wang Shu, and we see him here taking his inspiration probably from the pagoda architecture in his buildings in the university, in the art university in Hangzhou. This is a hotel in a sugar factory in China, which also in which the architects decided not to pull down the old industrial buildings, but to keep them. And this is another very important building from the point of that incorporates local memory. It's by Liu Jiakun, and it is to commemorate the life of a child, a young girl, who was killed in the earthquake of a few years ago. A very simple structure, but one which reproduces her house and her room. This is another way of responding to yet another way of being a regionalist architecture. This is the Ju-Air housing project in Beijing, done in the early 60s, carried out by Gu Liangyong, which addresses the importance of housing and incorporates it inside a regionalist movement. And this is the final slide. It's not necessarily what you would see as a regionalist project. It's a new housing project in the new territories of Hong Kong. It's social housing. 50% of Hong Kong people live in social housing. This is social housing that is designed and paid for by the municipality. And what differentiates it from the others is its ecological consciousness. It's built in the middle of this forest and incorporates pathways for bird watching, for it has kept the brooks and little rivulets of water for people to walk around in, and has preserved, it's turned the surrounding landscape into a natural, readily accessible for pedestrians, naturally into a natural preserve. And that is it. Thank you, Professor Segawa, Hugo, for
communicate is, first of all, why after years with great interactions to reconstruct this book after the invitation of the publisher. And as I can explain another time, what actually our new, banal word, our new market is about, and what the publisher believes in an opportunity through this new market to bring in new statements, renewing architecture. And last, to understand a little bit the context, what our new project is going to be is a short book on architectural education today and in the future, in the context always of the historical background. So I start. Why this redoing of the book? As you know, probably we started this whole adventure back in the end of the 70s. Why this urgency today? Well, as you will see in the rest of the lecture, the more we talked about regionalism, the idea of regionalism became opaque and not even opportunistically exploited to serve all kinds of purposes and goals, having very little to do with the continuity of a drive and an ideal of regionalism that goes back to the early globalization in the Greek imperialist times, the Roman imperialist times, and so on. So the why is how we can, in this muddled, contradictory, oscillating world, we can reveal, I say, to use a term, the dialectics of it. Why there is contradiction, why each phase in history there is a change, where are we today, and implicitly what has to be done, because ultimately this is what desperately needs today. So, from this point of view, we try to explain before anything else in the new book what is critical. Because critical, as we throw it in the historical debate, has become an obscurity device for finished, lots of smoke theory rather than a driving force in architectural thinking and practice. Critical also has been hijacked, interpreted in the sense of I criticize, I resist. In fact, critical again has a long history, and critical has to do with crisis and judgment. The origin of critical comes from exercising informed judgment and not being stubborn, biased, and not being a victim of oppression, either populist, present in ancient Greek also, at the time of Socrates, or police. So, that's the idea of the critical. And critical, more than criticism and resistance, involves engagement. Engagement with the public, engagement with the community, engagement with action to change the world, and not just to say no. However, before action and engagement, you have to stand back and, as a judge, say why things are the way they are, why they not in a different way, why can't we make them different, why the world cannot be better. That's my general introduction. I was somehow planning to surprise you, Patricia, another day, that as we speak, I don't only show you these images, but also I make some drawings in real time to describe through diagrams and maybe sketches of some ideas the other way around. So you all may go to class, so you can see action, not only foot, but also figures which are not only photographs and reproduction. That's it. Now we can go, if you wish, and we can try to run through the whole 20 minutes. You have 20 minutes?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, then I need the images. Then you don't see me anymore. You see the images.
You can see it also, the image, then you can see both of you also.
Yes?
You can see the image now?
No.
Sure.
Well, maybe Alex could.
So why we can't see the images?
Because it's the same problem. Fantastic. Close. Oh, great. Close.
you're from the other side of the Atlantic, and the other one, you know what it is about. But apart from the jokes, why actually I would like to start with that? I would like to start with a very important conclusion, which you will hear in the end of this short talk, which is that architecture is not buildings. Architecture is a world within a world, and buildings are part of it as much as part. In the very end, it has to do with objects, but it has to do with people. It has to do with people who move, who interact, and try to make not only money and survival, but try to make pleasure, try to make, after all, to quote Aragon, malgré tout, la vie est belle, the beauty to be alive, the beauty of life. So that is why I bring up this essential point. We will be talking about buildings, but it is about a world, and it is about you and me in dialogue through architecture. Now I move. This whole thing, this debate, has its roots with Sartre and myself, where Sartre was 50 years older than I was, in our shape of community, when in the middle of the excitement of the early Kennedy years and the stepping out of the catastrophe of the post-war times, soft catastrophe, cold catastrophe versus the hot catastrophe of the war, we are facing with that what is to be done with architecture. I am not going to go into detail analyzing that. On my left side, there is this diagram of Gidabor, who says, what? Globalism, city, community, Paris is a collection of fragments. It's a collection who don't talk to each other. It's a collection, she doesn't say, but it is implied that soon as many times before, we're competing but also confronting each other. On the other side, you have a famous diagram by Weber, who says, through transportation and communication, we have no more places, no more regions, no more classes. We are all free, participating everywhere. To which Sartre said, when everything is available, nothing is possible. And the images on the bottom, very obvious, the cover of the Life magazine about a disastrous situation in the 1960s of the environment, called city, but had to do with the whole environment, and the well-known Babel, the well-known constructing, and through that separating and destructing. Well, destruction finally arrived with an unprecedented critique, as we all know, of the welfare state architecture, of public housing of public enterprises, of modern architecture, and the will to change the world, because no improvement is possible. It is the lucid pessimism, the cheerful pessimism that comes all the way from the Hellenistic times through Nietzsche, through Tafuri. On the bottom, you have the solution. The solution is us and me in a world of unrealizable utopia, which can be represented through buildings. But as you see, the buildings are only toy-like uses for having not a really good life, but good time, big time. Okay, so in response to that, we were getting more and more frustrated because the situation was not changing. And then, what did we face? We faced the expansion, the conquering of globalization, unstoppable, and at the same time, an interesting phenomenon, which is regionalism against regionalism. That is, fake regionalism dislocating and misrepresenting the path, the long-term path of regionalism. Now, here is a regional village in Switzerland and a regional village in Austria, and the regional village in China. I leave it to you to make up your mind where is what. The fact is, the Americans, in the name of regionalism, of projects of regions everywhere, as faith for the sake not of solving problems, but escaping problems and profit. New things which are not new, but get a gigantic scale at our time, as in the post-first edition of regionalist architecture, is on the top inequality and the great waves of immigration, migration that dissolve completely the idea of identity, region, and diversity, accompanied with conflict, but also, as we see now, with disease and virus. So, another phenomenon is the increasing, of course, pollution. You can see it going up and creating an umbrella protecting from nothing, and a filter of the sky, of the sun, and emerging out of it of giga projects. Why, they asked me when I showed that years ago in a Docomomo conference, you associate smoke with high-rise buildings. Well, I would not try to answer it now, but there is a strong link. Well, maybe history can tell us. We go back to, not the Bible, that speaks about the rising smoke from the bush, to the counter-reformation projects, that's Bernini, trying to materialize this coming smoke from the bush. And the fascination with gigantism in the project self, but also a fascination with the force and the power behind the, of all things, destructive presence of truth. Okay, I made a subjective history. How can we solve world life? I say, well, we need a critical view, because actually it is not only the enemy, globalization. In fact, I end up very quickly by saying globalization, our friend, but also we are facing this enemy from within, that is, the fake regionalism, and as we come to our days now, the regionalism of terrorism, in fact, and we try to explain it. If we look at the phenomenon, we try to explain it metaphysically without any background. We just elevate ourselves, because metaphysics means going above what we perceive, the physical world. We are in a meta world. We don't know in a meta world, but we go in world in depth. But this world in depth is historical. So we start in the book with the true views. A terrible mistake. We should have started with a much more global discussion juxtaposing the classical and the peripheral, the regional and the global, discussing how these ideas were already present in theoretical books, because not only Greeks and Romans had theory, in China and in India. Again, we didn't do it in the book, and I don't intend to do it today. Well, Liane is pointing to me to explain, as you can see here, at the very top is the northern house, at the very bottom is the house of the desert, and next to it is the middle world of obviously the Greco-Roman world, and the political argument behind that. Now, the true views, I could spend hours to explain to you, like the creation of the Roman law that still lives with us today, probably more in Brazil rather than in the Netherlands or in America. The Roman law still is organizing our life, like the classical, the ideas of the classical architecture still organize our life. The same with other areas. And the Vitruvius book was a compendium like the Chinese books about Feng Shui and the Indian book I saw on the bottom, how to organize the world, recognizing the regional, but actually promoting the Pax Romana, the harmony of the global. Okay, now I have to run. On here you have what we didn't do, which is the classical and the classical Chinese. Now, in both cases, they were perceived as something eternal, metaphysical, the highest creation of humanity, and the rest being regional, the rest being the lower level. In fact, this is in both cases a creation of the regional. This is not so much expanding, it's only one chapter in our book, but I have written a whole book about the classical Greek architecture and its genesis. By now, archaeologists that we are in friendly discussion and anthropologists, they all recognize in the beginning was the region. In the beginning was the tribe, and then comes the dialogue. And the dialogue in the case of the Mediterranean world was through the sea. In the case of China, it was through the migration and interaction of rather cumbersome, this is before the canals of China, but what I have in the picture is the Silk Road. The Silk Road is not only important for the internal of China, but of changing the world. How? By recognizing the integrity, diversity, and uniqueness of the regional, communicating it in dialogue, and then comes the phase of synthesis. And this is analyzed for the genesis of the Doric, Ionic, and so on in our book. Well, after the collapse of the Greek experiment of globalization, the Roman experiment of globalization, the globalizations of the New Europe, which destroys the regions that succeeded, the empires, comes back a revolt of the region. And we try to follow that inside center of our book. And I mark here two pictures that are very important. One is from Strasbourg. We used to live on this canal, and it points to the Strasbourg Cathedral. A young man, having fallen in love, comes there to overcome his weaknesses and finds a solution by finding an identity. And I don't go through the details, but there is an incredible text by the great poet and humanist Goethe, finding the idea of German architecture as being equal, if not higher, to the Italian and the French. Well, a few years later, Goethe is becoming very, very famous and very powerful and very creative, with lots of love affairs, and he goes back to the regional. He becomes the first person that creates a compendium of, it comes back to the classical, a compendium of poetry from Hebrew. He learns Hebrew as a young man, Persian, Arabic, a universal anthology demonstrating the globality of the human culture. Very quickly on the other side, you have the Cathedral of Köln in ruins, much worse condition than Strasbourg, and here is a project to reconstruct it So it brings up the idea of a liberated German tribe, oppressed again by the Romans, the post-Romans, the Italian culture, the French that occupied Germany at that time, the threatening of Russians, the Polish, and so on, and the idea of reconstructing the cathedral as a new constitution of regions, free regions, would bring together a community of communities, a German community. In short, the story is very different. The project is financed, taken over by the Prussians. The Prussians financed it, built it, and it is the beginning of an empire that ends, as we know very well, to today is the day of the Nuremberg trials, the anniversary, the day that almost destroyed the world in the name of an imperial globalization. Okay, now, regionalism, I won't tell you now the details, is taking many forms, and it becomes associated increasingly with the rejection of the classical architecture, the global classical architecture, the rejection of the aspiring global empires like France and Spain. We're talking about 17th, 18th century, and the idea of a world of regions which will maintain a much more humane environment of creativity and humaneness. Now, the fact is, very quickly, in this adventure and oscillations of regionalism, the fact is it becomes part of entertainment of the court global culture, or the court, the French court of, in the process of aspiring a global empire, end of the 18th century. I won't tell you how that happened, it is in the book. And then, by 19th century, after the adventure, creative adventure of Napoleon and destruction, not only of the old regime of globalization, destruction of the whole agricultural, regional, but under a regime world of Europe. So once more, architecture becomes a vehicle to argue for culture of a region, in other words, emancipation, creativity in a unique framework with by and for free people. But it's much more sophisticated now. We have two sets of illustrations, Eurologic and Ruskin. They are both understanding a kind of ecological reality behind the regional and the global, and not only as a metaphor, they try to inform people of the necessity to build buildings, but also communities and the world which relate to the diversity of regions, to the difference and the multiple worlds versus trying to impose oppressively a uniform standard. Well, very quickly, then we jump into the book to the appropriation of the idea of regionalism, once more using an older trick. As I described, the region is aspiring to become bigger and bigger and bigger, and in the end aspiring to become an empire. And we see that, tragically, very beautifully demonstrated in the creation of the Heimat culture, Heimat meaning home, more or less. It's much more rich than home. The home culture, that is the regional culture, that comes out of Goethe, but instead of aspiring to this kind of liberating aspect within a community of regions, it becomes a slogan, it becomes a dream, it becomes a symbol for creating a new imperium. And you can see this Bavaria, Heinrich Schultz was an organization that covered within few years the whole Germany, from children, and that's very important, to old men, from people who chant local songs to people who try to create, like Wagner, a truly German music. Okay, and here is the end of time. Those are buildings of the so-called, in quotation, culture of Nazism, a youth club, a community club, and so on. Okay, that's the story of the book, goes all the way to this oscillation. And now what? We complain, but of course the message is not very pessimistic. We always, a destruction and a fall is succeeded by a new return to the aspiration, freedom, diversity, uniqueness, humaneness, community. So, what's the problem? Why continue writing this story? Well, some things happened actually during the last, let's say, 20, 25 years. A new generation of young architects emerges, and emerges all over the world, who to try to avoid the pitfalls of fake regionalism, the violence and the culture of separation and non-authenticity, by going back to a more truly, authentically regional architecture. Now, where architects, how is it expressed? For the first time, we see a true inventive not only relation of the building to the landscape, and it is obvious here, a relation to new use of materials, the materials that continues being one shoe, the Pritzker Prize, a Chinese architect, the materials are ecologically good, that is, they reuse and not spoil resources for building, materials that belong to the region, and they don't come creating an ecological and environmental impact plus the cost, and materials that are not anonymous imports. They speak a song of memory and history. That is, when you see them, you see behind them communities, waves of communities cultivating this land, working in this region, and trying to create a joyful life. Okay, and I won't name the projects, you can see them in the book. That's one unprecedented relation of materials which are friendly, ecology. I have a list very rigorously discussing why this is an unprecedented, truly regional material without fate, and why it is really all about the pleasure of life and beauty as the hope of happiness. And again, that's another project. What's interesting about that is that regionalism is not only about, I don't want to name names, big complexes of universities of whatever, with roofs, and repeating 19th century stories about picturesqueness in a bad sense, but tiny projects. One from on the left is by Jean-Claude. I won't tell you who is Jean-Claude, you should find out. Fascinating architect, building, giving a new life inside the most dense neighborhoods. They call them slums. They became slums, very dense urban neighborhoods of Chinese, in this case of Beijing. In the other case, Liane showed you that, and the story again is interesting. This new generation of people not only tries to react picturesque from a picturesque point of view to the background of that, but it is reusing material that don't have to be imported. Reusing material by employing local technicians or local people and not having to import machines or other know-how. However, what is exciting about that is that the form you see here is done using the most sophisticated CAD computer technology guiding the weaving of the local material into this shape. Okay, very quickly, the new generation also says, well, we're not interested in the shape of the mountain behind us only. We're not interested only in the formation of the ground. We're interested in people, in opening up their eyes in the total environment. That is the world within the world is building and the sky. And so on discussion of some poetic length, why this whole, how it relates to what the people do under this whole, how it is a message for saving the ecology, but also for saving community. The ecology of the region and the ecology of the community of friends. This is a kind of, it's a Quaker community. And I want to analyze our dear friend, Yu Kongjiang is a descendant of, well, it's a long story. It's an incredible landscape architect. Well, okay, so the new regionalism is not only about a building and its outline of the building. It's not only about reflecting the shape of the mountains and all these picturesque places. It is also, it can be huge. This is a shopping center in Singapore, and it is by Toyolito. And Toyolito, instead of, first she declares that she wants something that expresses but also enhances, interprets, celebrates a community and a way of life. Further on, the idea of creativity and exploration. How was that? Not only through the geometry, but also you can see it on the upper part. This is built, this is a huge shopping center, but at the same time, it's a kind of small port. People come constantly through bus boats or through little boats or bigger boats like outside of Singapore. And the shopping center is a game. It celebrates, it points to the hope of beauty, or beauty as a hope of prolonging happiness. And in the very end, we have to recognize now not only the huge scale of a project, which can be regional, but also the idea that the regional is addressing a community of communities. It is a bridge, it is a harbor, it is a path that is pointing to globalization. But this is a globalization going back to the paths and the archipelagos of Aegean, of Mediterranean. It is not a globalization of thoughtless importation only for the sake of profit or maybe for the sake of blind egos. Okay, here that's another project which comes from southern Italy, and I will not attempt from Sicily to analyze it. This is a project that expands all over a section of Sicily, unites a region. How does it unite a road? And the roads unite. Roads globalize, but also bringing internal connections of the community. But also, it is pointing out the uniqueness of the place, not only in terms of character of the physical character of nature, short nature, surfaces, long nature, distance, but also history. I don't have the time, and you don't have the patience, I'm sure, to listen to me telling you how an old post office, how an old hunting lounge, and how old meeting places of peasants who still meet today is linked together, that is reinterpreted, revived, and recreating together with pointing the pleasure of life, the community, and the future. Okay, so what's wrong about all that? Why do you have me here lecturing to you in a kind of sad, dramatic voice, while everything is, if it wasn't perfect in the past, with all kinds of bad adventures in between, why? One can say, in my defense, yes, because despite all those projects, the rest is a mess. So let's have more of those projects. And I will say that's the problem. Let us not have just more of these wonderful, dreamy, creative masterpieces of new, critical, but uncritical regionalism. Why? Because it is the only idea that goes back to Vitruvius, that we can make a better world by adding a good building or a masterpiece. This is something which no more can be accepted. In a situation of true crisis as we have today, of a pollution that has no specific regional application, but can overcome any identity of borders of regions, of forces of immigration and migration, of forces of fake regionalism accompanied by intrusive terrorism. We, not to mention, of course, our dear virus, adding isolated masterpieces to the environment, isolated stars, is not improving the overall environment. Even more, it doesn't guarantee it will save life and humanity if we keep on doing the same kind of fragmented, Me Too, aggressive practice of adding buildings only with a hope, I would use a Marxist term, added value, which was at a certain moment very fashionable 20 years ago. And the idea that we need star architecture, star buildings to make a better world, which is by now proving that it doesn't lead anywhere. And then what? And this is the moment to conclude my talk. Impatient with fake regionalism, impatient with all kinds of distortions of what regionalism is about, frustrated with very esoteric discussion about regionalism is a form of metaphysics and also a form of life, way of life, way of nature, way of building, we suggested, and this is what the cartoon is on the top, up there, I don't know if you can see, to erase the middle of regionalism and add to it, or rather unite the two broken parts into realism. We need to deepen our embracement of reality. We need to deepen critically through analysis, but also history, because that's fundamental, of how the world is made, how it is being changed, why instead of getting a better world, we get several times, not always, a worse world. And try, that's an esoteric diagram, which I start by Waddington. Please either read Waddington or read our book, describe the human-made and nature-made world as an epiphenomenon controlled by underlying forces, which is what we have to understand, what we have to know, and we have to maintain in face of not only destruction, but also fakeness, and make a world of regions as actually a jungle is made. A jungle, 19th century, and still today, Western people like to call a jungle a place where people eat people, a place where people don't understand what enjoyment is, but only through killing, rape, and eating. In fact, this is not what a jungle is about. A jungle is about ecological dialogue between species, ecological encounters, growth, disappearance, and renewal. And the closest we can express as a metaphor is a jungle. The alternative, well, if you look again and again in the history, not only of architecture and culture, but also of nature, is again and again the retrieval of life and the turning of the earth into a desert. So desertification is actually the future, and I'm not like Le Corbusier saying, or rather, I won't be afraid to be called like Le Corbusier saying, architecture or not a revolution, a desert. And now, the time is to wish you to have very good and safe and healthy evening. And if you are not happy with that, we can redo it. And how long? Oh, it took me a little bit longer than I thought. I'm terribly sorry for that. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor Segawa. Hugo?
Pedimos desculpas pelas falhas técnicas, esperamos poder recuperar o áudio e o vídeo quando fizermos a edição que estará disponível no YouTube. Bem, reiteramos então aqui o nosso convite para segunda-feira, próxima, dia 30, às 9 horas, vamos ter uma conversa ao vivo com Liane Lefraive e Alexander Tzonis, e vamos conversar por cerca de 1 hora sobre essas 2 falas que apresentamos agora, e esperamos poder contar com, enfim, aos interessados e aos que puderem participar, na segunda-feira, às 9 horas, dia 30 de novembro. Eu agradecemos a audiência, o acompanhamento de vocês e esperamos encontrá-los todos na próxima segunda-feira. Muito obrigado a todos, muito obrigado à equipe do FAU Encontros e até a próxima. Obrigado.